And in spite of the qualifications that you draw, it would be difficult to think of any philosophical doctrine that had been more influential in the last 200 or 300 years.
No, because you're quite right, because it was in terms of that distinction, which he proceeded to muddle in a fruitful and interesting, but I would suggest ultimately mistaken way, that Kant set the main problem of his own theoretical philosophy, the critique of pure reason. He wanted to say there was a third type of assertion over and above truths of reason and truths of fact as described by Leibniz. And for a good deal of the 20th century, in slightly different terminology, the distinction between those two things has been absolutely central to philosophy. Some teachers of the subject, when I was younger, used to say, whatever else one does to one's pupils, if one gets that distinction across to them, it's been worthwhile their studying the subject. And that, I think you're quite right in saying, was put onto an altogether new level of clarity and explicitness by Leibniz.
Sometimes, because of our somewhat parochial Britishness, we tend to attribute this doctrine to Hume. And it is in Hume, and he probably did work it out for himself on the basis of pointers from Locke, as you say. But the fact is that Leibniz said it half a century before Hume, and said it very clearly, and said it over and over again.
Yes, the thing about Hume is it's done in a kind of drawing room, relaxed, rather imprecise manner. The nature of the distinction isn't very precisely worked out, whereas in Leibniz's case, a great deal of energy is expended on making it quite clear what the logical foundations of the distinction are.
Yeah. Another thing that Leibniz offers us is a solution, again, to the Descartes problem of interaction, a solution to the problem of how mind and matter interact. And his solution is entirely different from Spinoza's solution. Can you tell us what it is?
Yes, I mean, insofar as it is a solution, it's rather like preventing oneself losing at chess by kicking the table over, because in effect, he says, the matter is not real, matter is phenomenal, and so there isn't any matter in itself for mind to interact with. Everything that really exists is in some degree or other mental in nature. At the lower end, very rudimentary. At our end, quite sophisticatedly mental, and of course perfect in the case of God, who is a purely mental being, not at all the extended, all-inclusive physical entity of Spinoza's system.
Now, if he thought that there was, in fact, nothing sufficiently materially real to interact, how did he explain apparent causality? Because the world does, in fact, seem to consist of things interacting with each other.
Well, let me give you the short answer first, because it's going to provoke, I think, a further question. I mean, the short answer is, here are all this infinite array of mind-like entities which constitute the universe. And he says each of these, and this is actually what he says, each of these has a perception, very often a very obscure, confused, and limited perception of all the others. It has a point of view on the whole world. Now, each of these inner worlds of perception, the picture of the world formed in each of these spiritual centers.
And one should make it clear that these include us.
We're included.
Yes.
Is correlated. It's different from, but correlated with the perceptions of others. Like a whole lot of photographs taken of a scene from different points of view. They all, of a wedding group. Some of them show the back of the head, some of them from the side, some of them from the front. But all the same persons can be identified. Well, likewise, every individual monad has its own perspective on the world. Now, Leibniz's view is that there is, in fact, no interaction between monads. There's merely a correspondence between their contents. Each monad has its own inbuilt history, which develops. One quality succeeds another in the history of the monad. But part of the content of the monad, a very principal part of the content of each monad, is its awareness of other monads, and they are correlated by what he calls a pre-established harmony. And sometimes he uses this as an argument for the existence of God, that there is a pre-established harmony. Perhaps he needs God to show that there is such a thing.
I mean, this seems to be attaching overwhelming importance to God in the scheme of things, that God created everything, ordained the way everything is, keeps everything going all the time, including us. And therefore, there is no need for a belief in causality. I mean, the very idea of causality is it's a sort of extraneous or superfluous concept, because God is doing it all the time. And there's therefore, as it were, no way in which things can cause other things by interacting all is being caused by God. But in this picture, how can free will come in? Because Leibniz certainly thought that he believed in free will in some sense.
It's quite right. His arguments for the existence of God are fairly traditional and conventional. They have some slight new attachments or modernities about them, but on the whole they're very much like those of Descartes and Anselm and others further back in the history of the subject. But what he does with the idea of God is very striking. I mean, he carries the idea of God's omnipotence a very long way and says God creates all the other monads that constitute the world and equips them with an intrinsic nature which decides or determines everything they subsequently do. So everything, as it were, is prepared by God. Leibniz himself doesn't see this theory of programming, as one might call it, of all the contents of the universe, which, as you rightly say, rules out literal causality between one thing and another, which is at best some sort of correspondence or regularity of happenings in one and another. Leibniz reconciles this as far as he can with free will, and indeed quite well, because in a way what lack of free will is to be caused to do things by something outside you, to be externally compelled to do something against the grain of your own real nature, you might say. Well, in Leibniz's picture of the world, every individual's determining force, once we get one on from God, so to speak, is the nature with which God has equipped that individual. So Leibniz, in a somewhat debating society way, could say, in no system of the universe are individuals freer than in mine. Every individual is perfectly self-determining. What more could you ask for freedom? But let me just make a more sensible comment on that. I mean, I was throwing myself into the metaphysical idiom there. The thing is, it seems to me that it's very difficult for rationalism to allow for anything we'd recognize as human freedom just because of its intellectual ambition. It's determined to explain everything. But if everything has an explanation, it looks as if that explanation is going to be causal, that everything that happens is going to be intelligible as part of some huge unitary design or plan.
So there's no room for the toss of the coin.
And there doesn't seem any room
yes
for any freedom for maneuver for the individuals in a world as conceived by rationalists.